Welcome to the Dieku Podcast with Gary Snow.
Welcome to the Dieku Podcast. I'm Gary Snow. There's been a few really great crossover panels hosted by Ben Milton over at Questing Beast YouTube channel. And as an aspiring designer, the topics that interest me the most are about design in the industry. As a patron of Questing Beast, I was able to pose a question on the most recent featuring Hankerin of Runehammer channel and Trent from the Miscast YouTube channel. My question was, where do you see the trends for game design evolving, particularly OSR, but I'd be interested to know their views on the industry in general. I would never do justice to capturing the full conversation, so you should really just watch it if you can. But the one point that I really wanted to dive in on was Hankerin's analogy of the skateboarding industry in the 80s and the 90s, and how it became so corporate, and then the subsequent backlash against it in the highly synthesized production of what was skateboarding at the time. So Hankerin believes that RPGs are going through the same process today. I could actually really relate to this because I appreciate games that have unique vision. And when sometimes you see some of these like really glossy, high production value products that D&D 5th edition put out, there's something kind of missing to that. And as they say, a camel is a horse designed by committee, which essentially means that the more voices you allow to provide input, the more homogenized the result becomes. So when you look at it as a singular vision, like there's an artist or a designer and they're making their own game, you stand the chance of being unique from the rest of the crowd. And I think people really like unique. And as Hankerin described it, you can see where the interns have had their hands in sculpting the minis, and it makes you feel connected to the company or the person who makes them. And I don't necessarily mean, I don't necessarily think he means poor production values. But I personally have the desire for high production values in the games I make, but I want to ensure that my fingerprints are on every element. I want you to know that I made the game, that the game reflects my design choices and aesthetics. So if I have high production values, it's because I want that value in the game I make. But ultimately, it'll still be a unique product that just happens to have high production values. Nothing generic. And so that's something that I want to see in the worlds that I make or the settings that I make. And you can see this kind of trap that these small companies in all industries, not just the RPGs, kind of fall into. They have success, but they can't maintain it on either the single person or the small team that created it in the first place. So they end up needing like a product manager, a marketing team, creative directors, art directors, writers, admin, HR, IT, staff meetings, distribution, and probably a lot of more positions that I'm completely unaware of. So they have to scale up, and inevitably they lose a little bit of their soul in the process. And they produce usable products that have a wide reach because the first one was very popular or has been for many years. But the sheer scope of them always almost necessitates a process that destroys their identity. And because the barriers of entry into the RPG industry have never been lower, you can now see individuals with unique vision that they're able to get things to market, and the market is actually really responding. Take examples like Ultraviolet Grasslands and Electric Bastionland. You have Luka, Rejek, and sorry if I'm pronouncing your name not quite right, and Chris McDowall from Electric Bastionland. They both have a unique vision for their games that comes through in the design. I was reflecting upon the series of books, Designers and Dragons, and that's written by the historian Shannon Appelcline, and you can get those at Evil Hat. I've got all 4 copies through the years, and so it starts from the 70s, and then it goes to the 80s, 90s, and then the 2000s, and that's as far as they've taken it, even though in theory, at some point they'll maybe do the next 2010s. But it certainly brought back memories of my own experiences over my 30 plus years that I've been playing. So when you look at these cycles, when you've been doing it as long as I have, and you can look at them with broad strokes, you know, the 70s had OD&D, like the original, that evolved out of chainmail, tabletop war games. The RPG rules were super minimal. They were inconsistent, and in many cases, they probably just didn't even exist. So DMs made them up on the fly. And then in the 80s, there's like a desire, with Gary Gygax, he wanted to codify some of these inconsistencies as the industry blossomed, and the games and products were more consistent for tournaments and conventions. And then that's, my entry into the world of Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games with my red box as a 10-year-old. And I have to say, I remember playing my very first game with my friends. We kind of glossed over the rule book. We didn't really understand THAC0. We didn't really understand hit tables. So our probably solution was, well, not probably, it was our solution that you needed an 11 or higher on a D20 to be successful in hitting. And it seemed like a good number. It made sense to us. And at the end of the day, it was essentially a bunch of kids sitting around telling a story to each other. But it was the most fun that I had role-playing because we were innocent and it was a lot of fun at that point. So how bad could that actually be? Not bad, right? However, in the 90s, the industry started to mature, and AD&D and First E and 2E formalized many rules, and then you had all the compendiums, and then you had rules lawyers, min-maxers, and it got kind of crunchy. But the production values improved immensely, and the industry started to grow around it. So you had artists that were purposely doing fantasy art, and rather back in the old days you would have just a handful of people. So the rules and the systems got more complex. The open gaming license led to even more complexity and crunch, Pathfinder and D&D 3rd edition, 3.5, 4. The results in the were that just it got super duper crunchy, and then in the 2000s you can see the start of story-driven games powered by the Apocalypse, Fudge, Fate. They tried to remove that crunch and get back to the narrative fun. And that did speak to a lot of people. And I mean, obviously, those game systems are still popular today. But people that couldn't quite get into the story games, they still really liked a little bit of crunch, a little bit of game mechanics that were involved with it. And I didn't participate because there was a bit of a gap in my role-playing career, but the Forge, which I understand could be very contentious at times with this battle over story-driven games and crunch and what it means to role-play. So a lot of really good philosophical questions were answered at that time, or at least brought up in that time. I don't know if there's ever going to be a solution to a lot of them, but ultimately I think what it comes down to is there's different horses for different courses, and to each their own. Everybody kind of likes their own style of play, and that's ultimately, I think, what it comes down to for role-playing games. But where we are now is the evolution from Google Plus, from that, and the groups and the blogs that resulted, and ultimately the OSR flowed from that. And I was personally attracted back into the industry by Honey Heist by Grant Howitt. And I saw that and I went, boy, that inspires me going back to the simplicity of what a game can be. And so I was quite taken by that. And I've been kind of poking away at that for now, probably a couple of years of looking at that and thinking what a great idea it was. And, hats off to him and all the other one-page designers that have kind of blossomed in this environment. And it reminded me of those hand-waving days where I just had to roll 11 or over, and it was good storytelling. But I have to say, it is tough to reconcile this minimal of a game as an adult, at least not on a regular basis, maybe a one-shot. It's fun, and perhaps for me, though, it's a bit too much like just playing make-believe. It's just missing too much of the game portion because there's just not enough rules in place. And that's when I started to do my own searching for rule-light games that fall into that kind of happy spot of balancing the narrative part of it, the hand-waving, the feel-good 10-year-old, and the game part of it, the mechanics. And that's what essentially led me to the OSR, which for many and many other people, it scratches that itch that reminds you of what it feels like to be playing as a kid and just what role-playing games can be. So I kind of feel grounded in what I think OSR is. I'm not an expert at it, and my take on it, and at a very simplistic level, and the most frequent statement I hear is OSR is about rulings over rules. And I know there's more to it than that, but if I can take a crack at what it means, is essentially that you leave enough gray area that the DM is not hindered by hard and fast rules, or players for that matter. You make rulings on the spot and you use the balancing of a bare bones mechanics, and you leave it up to the interpretation of the DM and the players. So this goes back to the question I posed to the panel on Question Beast. where do you see trends going for the industry, and in particular the OSR? So it's maybe important to point out that the OSR had its roots in the retro clones, the basic fantasy, Swords and Wizardry, Osric, and old school essentials, where it was like trying to recapture that magic, but some of the, clearing up some inconsistencies. But now that I think we've basically gone through all the different clones or retro clones, and there's no more to redo, you're starting to see a new wave of design, and which I've seen one person actually described as the new SR, or instead of the OSR. And so from my perspective, when you've been around long enough and you've seen cycles, not just in role-playing games, but industry in general, and you see how things kind of repeat itself after a while, I think the people that are currently enjoying the OSR hand-waving of it will once again kind of find that, maybe there's not quite enough game mechanics there. Because in my experience, most players tend to compare attribute scores. It's just the way it is. Players like to have individuality, and when you have a game that only has 3 attributes and no skills, and a lot of it is up to interpretation, it kind of doesn't fit for some players. And I don't think the current games are far off, but I think with that cycle that I was mentioning, I think we'll go through that same transition from OD&D and transition to basic expert complexity. And it's kind of funny that, from my perspective, it's almost like a 30-year cycle to almost end up where we started. So, this leads me to some underlying philosophies on the Dieku game system that I've been working on and trying to solve things that I want to, or I just didn't like about certain gaming systems. And that's, once again, a personal preference, courses for courses. And I say this with a caveat that it's entirely possible that I might produce the worst game system in the history of RPGs. So, time will tell. I'll release it, and I'm sure there will be feedback on it. And obviously, I will add my voice into the world of the OSR, new SR, and the evolution of RPG, and hopefully people like it. But I just wanted to talk about maybe some of my solutions or preferences that I'm attempting to do in the design of the Dieku system, since we're on the topic of the industry and the OSR. So attributes and modifiers. I've never really understood why we have attributes and then there's modifiers from those attributes. And in classic D&D, a lot of the attribute scores don't do anything. There's no modifiers at all. And so it makes you kind of go, what's the point of even having the attributes 1 to 18 or 1 to 20, some people in some cases, and then the modifier. And, I've seen some ideas of, like, I think it's Mork Borg, where you get the attribute and then the modifier and then you throw the attribute away. And I'm kind of like, why do you even do that? Can you not combine them into one thing? And it's a redundant stat. You don't need to track the attribute and the modifier. So in the Dieku system, you just have the attribute. And so that's one item that I'm hopefully going to solve, and I've developed a mechanic around that. And I also kind of found that concentration should count for something. And I know that in some systems that you can get an advantage if you just take the time, like just to say to aim, or if you're doing something where you're on higher ground, you get the advantage. But concentration rarely kind of like is always in focus in a lot of these systems. And I wanted it to be like a little bit more realistically. And the one that's always stuck with me for like 20 years now is like, there's passive actions and there's active actions. And the passive ones are kind of more like when you're on cruise control and you're just doing something, and then active actions that you actually concentrate on. And so in my system, I've incorporated both of those elements into your actions. And the other thing that I always kind of bugged me is when you look at the breakdown of a turn, it's always, well, where do you move? Like you do your move first and then you do your other actions, or, then you do your range weapons and melee weapons. And for me, it just it was a little bit too much of like, I think people were still stuck or still are stuck on the tabletop war games and how that started, where you have to move, like where it feels like you have to move. Like, what if I don't want to move? Shouldn't I get a bonus from that? And that goes back to my passive and active actions. Like for me, moving is an action, but if you choose not to move, you should gain a benefit from that. So that's the way the Dieku system is kind of set up, is that you can use a passive action and an active action, and there's more detail to it in the game system, but as a high level, that's kind of the way it works, is that you can change your strategy within your action choices, and based upon those strategies, you get to do different things, and you might get an advantage or a disadvantage because of the way you're doing it. And it probably sounds more complicated than it is, because it's actually very simple. You only have two options. But I spoke previously about having in previous podcasts about having it to be similar to chess, so that there's basic moves, but within those basic moves, there's a wide range of strategy that you can take. So it should be easy for new players, and it never loses the complexity for the skilled player. So that's my goal with actions. And this leads me into skills. So as mentioned, I wanted to make attributes the fulcrum of the system. Not modifiers, but attributes. And so you have the ability to use skills, or as I call them, actions, in the Dieku system. And I've noticed that, a lot of OSR designers do not like skills. And I remember a recent Questing Beast episode where Ben Milton had Seth Skorkowski on there, and he asked the question, do you find having skills on character sheets make players look down at their sheets for solutions rather than approach the situation? So that was obviously kind of an OSR-driven question. But his blunt answer was, no, he's a skill-based player, which is completely understandable. He's a big fan of Cthulhu and Traveller, which use skill systems pretty extensively. But it definitely highlighted the current mood in the OSR that skills are frowned upon, as it tempts players to not be innovative in their gameplay. And perhaps this might be the point that I'm trying to make, where the OSR is, and perhaps where it eventually will be. Because I think right now the desire for the hand waving, it's almost like cleansing the palate after a meal or a course, and you need to cleanse the palate. There's so much crunch that the OSR is just a cleanser for your palate. But I do think at some point people are going to go, you know what, 3 attributes, I don't know if that's enough. And because people eventually do like to differentiate their characters. One of the skill systems that I always thought was really kind of well done, and I'll say the Dieku system kind of builds off some of the theories in it, is the Star Wars D6 by West End Games. And I know there's West End Games went under, but they did release the D6 system as open source, and so it's a really good system. You should go check it out. But my only complaint was about I hated adding those dice. So if you had a Jedi that was super powerful and they might have 8d6 on a skill, you would roll 8 dice and then you would spend the time adding them up, which I always was disappointed in. I mean, technically it worked, but the thing that I wanted to do in the Dieku system was have a single die roll resolution. And it's something about when you roll that 20-sided die and everybody sees the number you need, and when you see it come up or the finish rolling and it's a 18 and you needed 18, everybody cheers. Or if you needed a 18 and you got a 17, everybody's disappointed. But it's everybody knows kind of at the same time. And you just don't get that from multiple dice, and it requires too much of a mental connection there. And I know some people just go, just tell me if I hit, like I don't care. But I think there's something valuable about a single die roll achieving the outcome of the mechanics. So Dieku system is based upon that, which leads me into classes. And it's similar to skills, that some people do not like classes. And But I do think classes help sculpt the character and provide some context within the setting. So I think the OSR can fall into the trap that there's, you start with one class. Typically, you would have like a fighter, a group of fighters, it's the funnel. We're all going in. We have no skills. We're villagers. And then eventually the party and the characters kind of evolve from their actions in the environment, which is great. It does work and it's fun. I don't know if you could do that on a consistent basis, but I know some people do. But I always liked that classes kind of help define your character and the interrelation that they have within the party. I mean, every popular movie, they have different people doing different activities, and I think it's kind of important to set up a group like that, an adventuring party. So with the classes, at one point, I was all on board with just kind of doing the funnel and everybody being the same. And then as I started to really think about it, I think people like classes. It also adds character, and it makes the setting more evocative for them to kind of have a unique place within it. So I actually went the opposite way, where I was like, how many more classes can I build? I was excited to actually think of more classes, and it actually helped my world building as I went through it. So once again, I think people like to compare stats and have a bit of uniqueness. So going back to having attributes, skills, and classes, I don't think is a bad thing, even though I know it's probably not exactly a purist OSR kind of mentality. I still feel it can be done with hopefully the Dieku system, which is hopefully a very simple, elegant solution for that. One of the other not struggles, but many systems have, is that it works fine if you're using a sword, but what about magic? What about psionics? What about superpowers? Essentially, you need to create a universal system. And so you've got ones like GURPS, and the Tiny series does a really good job of that. And so they work for all facets, where you can take that system and move it into different worlds, and it works relatively well, where Dungeons and Dragons or the D20 and D20 Modern all kind of had some things you had to bolt on to kind of make it work. And because the City's Grim has all these diverse elements, powers, superpowers, psionics, magic, and combat, there's a lot of things that I had to take into account. So unknowingly or unintentionally, I've designed a universal system through the Dieku system, which actually I think is going to help me in future game settings that I've been noodling on and I can't seem to stop noodling on. So there's the City's Grim, and there's a few others already in my head lined up. So stay tuned for those. And perhaps one of the things that I'm most curious about, and maybe a change from a way a lot of game systems work, is I have no charisma or comeliness in other D&D games, or looks or beauty or anything like that in the Dieku system. None of it. And because, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. You have different people that can be better connected with different aspects of who they are. In the gangster world, you have more of sway over somebody that in polite society. And those social roles just have never kind of sat with me. That I try to convince the bartender to give me an extra drink, or if I try to get a deal on item I'm trying to buy at the shop, I just never liked it. I always thought you should role play that kind of stuff, and it goes back to my 10-year-old hand waving that you just kind of work it out in the RPG world. And so it's kind of funny that here I am. I'm not a huge story game fan myself, and here, I think this is almost making people role play. So with that said, I know some people might say, well, what about shy players? And if it's anything like life, the more you do something, the more comfortable you get at it. And I'm actually developing a whole write-up about how to assist and mitigate against people feeling uncomfortable. But I think role-playing and the social aspect of role-playing is a part of role-playing games. And I don't want to exclude anybody, but anyways, I've decided not to actually have any social reactions like that within the Dieku system. So that being what it is, there's other things that I'm looking forward to, such as the armor defense mechanism that I've been working on, and character alignments and backstories. And, probably those are topics for another day. But for me, the conversations that I've seen on Questing Beast have kind of circled around the OSR and the industry in general. And since I'm aspiring to put out some OSR variants within the world, I've found them very interesting. I just wanted to share my thoughts on them, and I welcome any feedback that you have on them, whether it's on our YouTube channel that I rebroadcast the podcast on, or on the podcast. Feel free to leave a phone message and tell me how stupid I am. All those are good, and I appreciate the dialogue. So feel free to reach out and visit us on social media. And if you're interested in playtesting the Dieku system, there's a form to fill out on diekugames.com, or you can follow us on social media at Dieku Games on Instagram, Twitter. I even started a TikTok, even though I don't quite know what to put on there. And as well as, I'm on a lot of Discord servers and Reddit. And so if you look for Dieku Games, I should be there. So until next time, stay safe and happy rolling.